Kate Mulefalcher, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. We are continuing with our Saturday book. We're on video number 4 of The Age of Insecurity by Astra Taylor, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart. I really recommend you go watch the first 3 videos. It'll make more sense for you because we're just going to proceed through the book. We're on chapter 4, Beyond Human Security. There is a group called the National Intelligence Council. It made a report in a magazine. I believe it's a magazine. They just said an edition of global trends. And they did predict some stuff in an age of expanding uncertainty. Extreme weather, water misuse, sea level rise, geoengineering, societal and government change, unequal burdens, instability, conflict, and more besiege people and will continue to contribute to our sense of insecurity. I think we know all this. Members of the middle class will lose their precarious financial footing. Now, this was predicted in 2021. And I think a lot of this is happening apace. Middle class losing their precarious financial footing, gains made by vulnerable minorities and women crumble, decreasing levels of social trust makes the globe more conflict prone and creates a volatile geopolitical environment. While the costs and challenges of the coming upheaval will fall disproportionately on those who have the least and who are least responsible for it, condemning about 1 billion people to the fate of climate refugee. 5 imagined scenarios that could happen, the trajectory that this could all take, 5 different suggestions. That this is just, what would I call it? Informed predictions based on knowledge of the moment and drawing conclusions from the past. So they see some of these things could possibly happen. A dystopian world where globalization is broken down, a fraught state of competitive coexistence dominated by Chinese and American hostilities, a revival of liberal democracy led by the United States and buoyed by technological innovation. A world broken into siloed blocks. I think that means disconnected groups. That leaves climate change unaddressed and poor countries collapsing. The 5th and final scenario strikes a hopeful note. Under the heading Tragedy and Mobilization, it conjures a global revolution in human security, where famine and strife and trauma from the pandemic and rebellious young people, challenging the permanence of borders, increased environmental concern, green parties taking over, which is actually starting to happen in Europe, and China joining an alliance with Australia and Canada. And then it says, and even the United States. But that was a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. So a new international organization of countries in general. So it would eventually result in a new Human Security Council. But this requires massive visionary social movement. The global trends in 2021, their report rightly acknowledged international institutions, domestic governments, economies, infrastructure, and incentives. They all had to be remade. And rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes are required to stave off catastrophe. None of this is a surprise. In fact, I think it's probably more obvious today than it was when this book was written 3 years ago. we can't only consider human security, we have to look at ecosystems and the natural world. Our worldviews exploit nature and in the process ruin ourselves. We've had 2.5 centuries of the combustion of fossil fuels. That hasn't worked out very well. They've interfered with biological clocks. They're all out of sync with each other. Animals give birth or migrate before or after food sources are actually available. That is an actual thing that's happening. Phenology is the timing of biological events. Who knew that was a thing? And they are recognizing that there's a mismatch in timing of natural ecosystems at the moment. Birds are arriving late. Insects are already gone. And they're gone because the plants are growing early. So these are subtle things that maybe only farmers and horticulturists, botanists would notice. We might think, the tree is late to bloom this year, but the reality is that there's a lot going on that's out of sync. Oh, here we go. Flowers bloom out of sync with pollinators. Pollinator, the bees. Co-evolved species are failing to connect on the time schedule. Young people have increasing distress over the future. I think, we've talked about that before, and it's self-evident. If you know any young people, they talk about it quite openly. What will be the response of the larger society? Authoritarianism is a possibility. Science could defend an unsustainable status quo, or turn around and start making an impact. Will people start? Well, the answer is yes, because this is already happening. Will people start building bunkers and retreat? We could use curiosity to devise cooperative strategies if we put our heads together. But there's fear because the future's unknown. Uncertainty makes people feel insecure. So this is the kairos, the propitious moment, the decision time. It's okay to be upset and to mourn what we've lost, but it's time to organize and act. In 2018, a group of young Canadians sued Ontario because of lowered emission standards. They trying to pull back on regulations. They said this was a breach of security for the whole world. Now, this was I'm going to say it wrong, Anishinaabe people, Native people in Canada. Well, they're also in the Great Lakes area, I think, of the United States. But they got together as a group and sued the government for lowering standards, claiming that it was a breach of security. So the Indigenous people have the lowest are the lowest contributors to gas emissions, but they are the most poverty affected, food insecure, least service provided group. What does it mean to be the blueberry people, they call themselves? What does it mean to be the blueberry people if no blueberries grow? Ontario's Supreme Court dismissed this in appeals. And they dismissed it, and it's in appeals, and the appeals could take a much longer time. It could take years. There should be more laws to protect the land. The Anishinaabe say the land is like a person, and the people belong to it, not the other way around. Like, we feel the land is ours to use, and they say, no, you cannot exploit it. It is a living, breathing organism. Global lawsuits like this, for example, in 2015 in Holland, they did a successful lawsuit and got emissions regulated more, lowered the emissions, and not just allowing people to go ahead and do it. In 2018 in Colombia, the Supreme Court there halted deforestation in the Amazon rainforest by saying it is a person, it's a living being. In 2008 in Ecuador, there was a thing about the rights of Mother Earth, and they put it into the Constitution. They call it Pachamama. I love that. In 2010 in Bolivia, in New Zealand, in India, in Ohio, they gave rights to the Lake Erie, tried to give it away, rights to do things in Lake Erie that were ecologically unsound. And a federal judge, surprise, surprise, said no. In 2019, the Minnesotans, the Ojibwe, talked about the rights of, I'm going to say this wrong, Manumen, which is wild rice, that it had rights and had to be treated appropriately. In 2021, the Quebec natives at the Magpie River, this is a quote, "We need to see that as humans, we are not above the water or the animals. We are part of a whole." Now, this is something that we would hope would catch on, this attitude. The Rights of Nature movement, is what this is called, challenges Western legal system and Western thought. We have dominion over people. This is very biblical. And corporations have dominion over everything. And we have to challenge that. It's not serving us. Plato and Aristotle were the only men, or believed that only men had rational intellectual ability. And this led to the medieval great chain of being, which is the hierarchical system we're still tortured by. It reflects our repressed insecurities. It's not a thing of strength. Hierarchical systems are all about defending themselves, the fear of being dragged down. It's defensive narcissism. It's, I think I'm so great and I'm going to defend that. A secure being would be able to respect other forms of life and just live in harmony. We see the nature as a storehouse to exploit. It's called suicidal anthropocentrism. In other words, a fatal placing of humanity at the center of everything. Or, as God the Father said to Adam, you have dominion over all. This is self-defeating across the ages. It's the cornerstone of capitalism and of colonialism and of communism. Stalin embraced Lamarck's theory of inherited traits changed in one lifetime. He believed he could bend nature to his will. They could re-educate the crops. And what they got from that was famine. Mao said that humans must conquer nature. And so this led to the death of 100 million sparrows. Locusts exploded and famine deaths went into the tens of millions as a result. So I guess they taught nature a thing or two, didn't they? This is avoidable suffering. Our longtime efforts to dominate nature have all backfired. We need to pay attention to that. There was a peer-reviewed study in 2021 that said by the end of the 21st century, climate change would result in 83 million excess deaths. And they're now saying that that's a vast underestimate. In 2021, the Lancet, which is the British medical voice journal, the Lancet looked at planetary health and said that 10% of global deaths between 2000 and 2018, roughly 5 million, are the result of extreme temperatures. By 2040, a quarter of children will be extremely water insecure. By 2050, there will be 1 billion climate refugees. Millions of species are going extinct, will be extinct because the food chains are disrupted, and this will further disrupt the food chain for birds and pollinating insects, and therefore for plants. Speed of intervention is so important, it matters. For example, in Grant Township, Pennsylvania, a place with 700 people, they sued the Pennsylvania General Electric Company for poisoning the local water by fracking. There was huge company pushback, and from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So is it right for the sovereignty of a community and the security of the people to be dominated by corporate rights? Do corporations have that kind of right? The gas company in 2023 abandoned the fracking plan. It just became too much of a headache for them. In 1516, Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. And it was really it was written in response to the enclosure movement. If you remember, we talked about in previous videos, taking away common land shared by all and making it private property, and therefore people who used to be able to access wildlife and plants and grazing were now suddenly poaching and trespassing, and it became a crime. So he spoke out about this. It was a huge issue in his time, 1516. Let's see what he had to say here. So put the word utopia into the lexicon. It's a play on utopos, meaning no place in Greek. It's a tale within a tale. A traveler describes his visit to a strange country where the inhabitants all hold property in common. Viewing themselves as cultivators of the land, not proprietors, the utopians are free of this insecurity and tumult produced by competition, acquisition, and loss. Men and women labor in essential trades such as farming, but only for 6 hours a day, giving them plenty of time to study and enjoy their religious freedom. There are no alehouses and no lawyers, which is notable because Thomas More was a lawyer. And couples get to see each other naked before they are wed. I guess that wasn't a thing in those days. If you inspect a horse before you buy it, the traveler says to his astonished interlocutors, shouldn't you take a good look at your future spouse before you commit? This was shocking stuff, I guess. It's very critical of capitalist hunger for land, for animal producing and profit, and multi-species crisis is recognized. And this was a very popular point of view that Thomas More expressed, reiterated by the radical diggers. We've talked about them before. In 1649, there was a pamphlet that explained the aims of the diggers' resistance. Gerard Winstanley described the earth as a common treasure of relief for all, both beasts and men. Diggers, like other radicals of the period, often greeted one another as fellow creatures, a gesture of solidarity and identification with all poor, mistreated beings. The role of animals in our economic system is obscured, but capital from Latin comes from capitalis, and it is means of the head, counting cattle, heads of cattle. That's where capital comes from. Like, how many cows do you own, basically? In North America, wealth is secured at the expense of animals, the enslaved and the indigenous. That's how we got where we are right now. Colonists brought animals and plants with them. Few survived. They died on the trip over. They went on to compete against the native species and to spread disease. Ownership of animals goes against indigenous concepts. Animals are not subservient to humans in most indigenous cultures. Some saw animals as part of their extended family. White people see them as to be dominated. Adam, you have dominion over them. These are two conflicting metaphysical worldviews. That's the problem. It's metaphysical. The commons could be exploited without any sense of responsibility in the English system. Colonial commons, that was to take from the land, all of it that was unsettled by white people was fair game. They saw the continent as a sprawling, exploitable resource. They denied or ignored indigenous rights and distinct governing systems. They didn't acknowledge them. They called them uncivilized because they didn't put up fences. John Winthrop, the second governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, reflected the standard settler perspective when he insisted that because indigenous people enclosed no land nor tame cattle to improve the land, their abundant territory could be appropriated. Colonists interpreted the lack of fencing as a sign of a lack of ownership, which in fact was merely a sign of a lack of livestock and thus a lack of a need for fencing. John Locke agreed. Two treatises of government existed. Why some people are entitled to take from others and to own everything exclusively. This is what he talked about. He argues that people are entitled to make land their sole possession by mixing their labor with the natural world, thereby improving and privatizing it. He contrasts these industrious and rational people unfavorably with commoners, by which he meant both English peasants and the indigenous people of the Americas, who he claimed let resources just go to waste. Like Greenland. Andy Ogles, representative from Tennessee, accosted a minister from Greenland and said, and I paraphrase, "What have the Danes ever done for you? What has Denmark done for you in Greenland? Look at all those resources just going to waste. America will come in and access those resources if Denmark's not going to." I'm not kidding. But then again, Locke had a financial stake in the shared American imperialist fantasy. The land hitherto untilled and therefore free to take without regard to wild Indians, they had no legitimate claim. This was the original Carolina land grants. However, colonists let their animals roam free. They didn't necessarily fence them up either. Free to forage for whatever they could find. Cows and pigs consumed delicate grasses, seeds, and roots and quickly reduced the land's capacity to regenerate, spurring their owners to take them even further afield, spreading the damage, right? Hogs dug up clam beds, cattle spread weeds, erosion took its toll. From Canada to Mexico, in what scholars describe as an ungulate eruption, the herds of hoofed mammals that arrived in colonization's wake radically changed the landscape and introduced a new biological regime that made it harder for indigenous people and creatures to sustain themselves. As the land became depleted, settlers pushed forward, moved elsewhere, enclosing and exhausting the land. The cycle repeated. It was the logical consequence of the colonial approach to the commons, one that undermines its own security by taking more and more instead of taking care. They hunted indiscriminately. Beaver was gold because of the hats that they made for the nobles only, by the way. Eurasian beaver were hunted to extinction, and so then they started hunting them in the New World, North America. The Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Company, owned by the Astors, they became real estate developers in New York City, and the beaver top hats, they marketed them as they made you smarter. So they had this thing called the Beaver Wars, where natives had no options and they had to help in the beaver hunt to survive. So it was a devil's bargain. The policy was to create a fur desert, total annihilation. And it was competition between the Hudson Bay Company to drive the Americans out of the market. They were successful. More than 6,000 beaver ponds were dried up and took wetlands with them. Today, beavers are a conservation success story. Between 1900 and today, they saved about 1 million in Europe. It's a keystone species. They didn't know this then. Beavers maintain the ecosystem. They support 80% of area's biodiversity. They help regulate temperature, flooding, drought, groundwater, erosion. Who knew that they did all this? Apparently, these dum-dums that were colonists didn't know. The outsized influence of beaver activity on water quality is a positive counter to climate change. They protective areas for fauna have been created because of fires. And now they're providing what they call healing habitats. So the author moved to Arizona as a child, and her grandparents lived in the middle of nowhere in the desert without services. It was, they were extreme Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman libertarians. She said they lived near a military toxic dump area and the water supply got contaminated, creating many deaths and disabilities. As a child, the author became obsessed with pollution, recycling, the extinction of species. It upset her family. She was upset that her family tossed bags of trash into old mine pits. She knew it was common land and should be treated with respect. Her grandmother thought humans were too competitive and sensitive to share. She believed that the idea of a common pasture would inevitably be overgrazed and polluted. Therefore, only private ownership could stop things from being wrecked, she believed. Approximately half of college professors still teach this as a thing. In 2009, 75-year-old Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics for a lifetime of debunking the tragedy of the commons. Decades of study of global resource sharing showed that they could be maintained and sustained. Valencia, Spain, did an irrigation system built by the Arabs. They have the system built by the Arabs 1,000 years ago. It still works, and it's used by 10,000 farmers today. They followed the rules. They trust self-monitoring and conflict resolution, and they share the system. That's only worked for 1,000 years. The jury is out. It's not a panacea, this sort of attitude, but it has possibilities. The National Intelligence Council described an insecure future, but insecurity is not always bad. It can motivate. It can shake up the faulty system that we're working from. For example, land ownership. Indigenous sovereignty would positively affect social justice and sustainability and economic security. It would be creating broader economic stability if we went that way, that system. There was a 16th century belief called terra nullius. In other words, land with nothing on it. New lands that were empty and just for the taking. Not true, but that's what they looked at it. In 1982, the Constitution Act in Canada gave official Aboriginal title to Indigenous land claims. It gave legal ability for them to sue the government for the rights, as they tried in 1984. It explains Native nations' approach to property law. And if I recall, it got a little complicated, so I may not go too much into detail, but for us, the ownership of territory is a marriage of the chief and the land. Each chief has an ancestor who encountered and acknowledged the life in the land. From such encounters come power. The land, the plants, the animals, and people all have spirit. They all must be shown respect. That is the basis of the law. So they testified with native songs and stories in the court. The judge objected. To have witnesses singing songs in court is not the proper way to approach this problem. He said he had a tin ear, one incapable of hearing what a mournful song had to do with a specific place or history. How could property be secured by words that are sung? So they gave 318 days of evidence and 56 days of closing arguments. And citing John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, the judge delivered his verdict. The Supreme Court agreed the indigenous peoples held a unique property right to their land. It was a collective interest held by a nation and by both present and future generations. By affirming the validity of oral testimony, the decision was also an important step towards bridging indigenous and Canadian legal traditions and making what is called common law more common, which is to say, more pluralistic and shared. So it took 10 years, and it was on appeal that the Supreme Court came to that decision, because obviously the first judge was a little dug in. Corporate lobbyists panicked about this situation. Corporate interests pushed the government to have natives surrender their rights. The UN opposed it. The UN stepped in. So impoverished communities are fighting against huge multinational corporations with lobbyists and government agencies abetting them. Profit to be made, right? The fight between the courts and the feds are backed by corporate money. Fossil fuel companies are eager to build infrastructures on native land, like pipelines. And there were native protests which met with Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, Dudley Do Right, the Mounties, met with violence. This is an example of the unsettling of a system of ownership that injures the planet. I mean, it's going to require big effort. In 1974, a guy called Garrett Hardin had the Lifeboat Ethics, the case against helping the poor. The only way for the rich to save themselves is to keep others out, to hoard resources, halt immigration, end food aid, international food aid, narrow the concept of security at the expense of others. And I just read that over 700,000 people have died as a result of removing U.S. aid from Africa. And that doesn't count people that have succumbed to HIV because they were on maintenance medication under U.S. aid. And it doesn't count the people who have contracted AIDS, HIV, because sex education, information, and condoms have been withdrawn by U.S. aid. There are climate change denialists that say social change is real, and the idea of addressing climate change creates threats to profit, lifestyle, and hierarchies. Then there's this thing called petromasculinity, patriarchal virtue associated with climate change, gas guzzling, red meat. And this goes against the opposite, soy boys, who are eco-aware, vegetarian, soft, emotional. And there's a contempt for non-white, non-male, not able-bodied people associated with this petromasculinity. It's associated with greater dehumanization of disadvantaged or marginalized groups, brutalization of animals, and certain lower humans on the chain of being. And it's a Pyrrhic victory because as they destroy the planet, they have to live somewhere. Megafires create heat domes, polar vortexes, superstorms, droughts. Commodifying animals, they have commodified 62% of all mammalian biomass, and it's led to deforestation. Only about 4% of wild animals are actually left. Indigenous people make up 5% of the world population. They protect 80% of biodiversity. The author champions solidarity with all species, if only for just crass self-interest, pragmatic self-interest. Pro-diversity is essential to our survival for food, for our resistance to pathogens. We need biodiversity to protect against the spread of disease. Land clearing leads to the emergence of 30% of diseases that are new. Livestock get 80% of all antibiotics. God, I didn't realize, I'd forgotten I'd written that down. It's a breeding ground for drug-resistant superbugs. Therefore, the American Public Health Association calls for a moratorium on factory farming. Can't even think about it. We have to work for human and natural world security. Solar or wind energy, planting green zones to lower the temperature. Human-centric, profit-driven attitudes still dominate, though. Biodiversity is biosecurity. U.S. and Canada passed recent laws to see environments and animal activists as urgent security threats, like PETA and people like that. They are being more and more targeted by both the U.S. and Canada. We need solidarity against authoritarianism and corporate interests. Cap and trade, sell a limited number of rights to pollute and then cap it. Cap the total number of polluters. Let companies sell and trade the rights, but just ban polluting at its source would be a much better solution. Income support during the pandemic was very effective. It's a promise that a collaborative ethos, a solidarity state of equality and interdependence could work. Nature needs rights, humans need obligations. We should replenish and honor ecological limits. It's a circular economic system, and we should be reusing, renewing, and regenerating. Some countries do it. They do it in the Netherlands. Attempts to conquer the earth are self-defeating. The earth is our mother. Petromasculinists want us to be alpha wolves, but they exist only in captivity. In the wild, there's no hierarchy amongst wolves in the wild. We need to demolish the great chain of being. Nature is an inclusive circle and not a ladder of hierarchy. And the ethos of humility needs to be nurtured. Humility about what we don't know because we think we know everything. Okay, chapter 5, Escaping the Burrow. The novelist Franz Kafka also worked hard for workers. He worked for the Accident Insurance Institute of the Kingdom of Bohemia in Prague. He worked with crazy bureaucracies, and he wrote about them as an outsider. He was trapped in this Byzantine power structure and felt helpless to escape it, and that's reflected in his books. He was known in his day as a dedicated industrial reformer with a conscience. He tried to be responsive to people, and his company insured a third of Austria's industrial workers. His job was to determine liability in accidents. He fought the bosses, always trying to blame the workers. They saw workers as a threat to their money, and bosses were often engaged in fraud to deflect responsibility for anything and to not have to pay. Hang on a second, let me find the page. In 1909, his friend Max Brod, to him, Kafka expressed his mounting frustration with hazardous industrial conditions. This is a quote. In my 4 districts, people fall off the scaffolds as if they were drunk or fall into the machines. All the beams topple, all embankments give way, all ladders slide. Whatever people carry up falls down. Whatever they hand down, they stumble over. And I have a headache from all these girls in porcelain factories who incessantly throw themselves down the stairs with mounds of dishware. Kafka wondered why workers did not rise up. Instead of assaulting the company building and destroying everything, they submit petitions. So he felt that workers needed to really aggressively advocate for themselves. He saw that insurance had social and political implications. Insurance deals with the uncertainty of the future and how to compensate for harm. It manages insecurity because everybody is vulnerable to injustice and the systems that are designed to oppress, and exploit. So how do you manage risk? At the start of the 20th century, the idea of insurance was completely revolutionary. For example, Social Security, that would provide material security, but people say it's a modern welfare state, and somehow that's not a good thing. It's protection against accidents, illness, disability, old age. They would all help regular people live like kings or gods. One of the first and most salutary effects of insurance is to eliminate from human fears the fear that paralyzes all activity, human affairs, the fear that paralyzes all activity and numbs the soul. In 1913, Isaac Rubinow, America's leading authority on social insurance, called it a new concept of the state as an instrument of organized collective action rather than of class oppression. It was a big threat to economic elites to have the state subsidizing care. They didn't want to share responsibility. The elites want the responsibility to be on the individual, and they have the money, so why would they care? And this was a war that was brought back. They're talking about war having brought back uncertainty, that personal debt and the criminalization of poverty is the outcome. In 1986, there was a new concept of risk society, that modern threats were compounding and they aren't unintended. They're not the unintended consequences of more modernity. For the lucky few, multiplying hazards are market opportunities. So they're kind of creating opportunities to make money off of the risk to other people. Therefore, those who suffer from risks are put in opposition with those who profit from the risks of the people who suffer from them. We all face risks in common, and we can be reactive or preventative. They don't want to spend money on being preventative. We can develop an ethic of insecurity and create systems of support and care because of our shared vulnerability. But these rich people feel insulated from risk by their money. Managing risk is about economics and morality. Cost, blame, safety, justice, solidarity. What kind of a world do we want to live in? Those are the things that we should be talking about. Insurance forces us to face our frailties and our mortality. Do we leave each other to sink or swim, or buoy strangers through life's rough waters, knowing one day we may need to be rescued ourselves? This is combining the fortunes of all for the security of all. Or do we choose a path of personal responsibility? How will we respond to insecurity? The author recalls 10 years ago picketing AIG in the wake of a government bailout. I think that's a bank. Government bailout for overrated mortgages and the bank collapse, the mortgage collapse. Bankers yelled, "Get a job," at the protesters, ignoring millions who lost jobs, homes, and the collective wealth of half the Black Americans that was lost. Ordinary people paid huge penalties. Wall Street was rewarded. They were rescued, and 73 employees got more than $1 million bonuses each for how it played out, for bailing out the banks. They rewarded 73 of these top rich guys, and the top bonus was $6 million to one guy. The imperious attitude of financiers brought down the economy in 2007, 2008. The commodification of risk comes at the expense of the common good. Insurance industry says that it provides protection from risk, but the story is more complicated, because of course it is. Risk is from the Latin riscare, which means to sail a ship around a cliff or reef. It conveys the prospect of a degree of danger, and the early maritime insurance existed in response to this riscare of sailing around a reef. That's where the earliest maritime insurance came from, in ancient China and Babylonia. It really boomed with transatlantic trade in the 17th and 18th century. As one agreement made clear, the seas, men of war, fire, enemies, pirates, rovers, assailing thieves, jettisons, letters of mart and countermart, surprisals, takings at sea, arrest, restraints, detainments of all kings, princes, or people. They would sign contracts that cover all of these calamities. That was an interesting combination. And during the time of traffic in the enslaved period of time, the Middle Passage, Lloyd's of London dominated the slave trade. Think about that next time you hear about Lloyd's of London. They were dominating the slave trade. 40% of its business was coming from the slave trade, and they referred to the people they kidnapped and enslaved as, quote unquote, perishable goods. Today, Lloyd's is massively profitable, built on a foundation of contracts that insured people as property. 2020, after George Floyd, it apologized for that shameful role in the slave trade and pledged to invest in programs to attract Black and minority ethnic talent and support charities and organizations promoting opportunity for Black and minority ethnic people without making specific monetary commitments. This was a vague and inadequate compensation from a firm whose website has boasted of having over £36 billion in net resources on hand. Commercial insurance is one of the biggest industries in the world. It's the largest national market in the USA. I believe it could be called a racket. Significant portion of it goes to private medical insurance because this affects to undermine universal public health care, which is supported by most Americans. Private medical insurance consistently records breaking profits. She gave the example of herself and her husband. They pay $15,000 a year with a $20,000 deductible. This is profiteering from people's insecurity because of the absence of public provision. In Canada, the insurance industry is lobbying hard against universal single-payer pharmacare plans that are being proposed. I don't know if that's been determined since this book was written. McKinsey Consulting highlights as a positive that shortfalls in Japan's national pension system. Using that as an example, the fear is that people Oh, people will feel it's a boon to business. So, they're arguing against people getting universal health care because business. In a crazy paradox, insurers cover the energy industry, which is creating climate emergencies that will cost insurers and which makes people sick. Insurers have $28 trillion in assets collectively. It's invested in fossil fuels, helping to escalate risk and loss. All it would take would be one perfect storm to hit Florida and decimate the industry and crash the economy, and that would spread internationally. Extreme weather costs potential trillions in liability. Insurers get reinsurance. And they're able to transfer insurance to insurance. And it transfers risk. Like insurance agents, insurance companies can insure themselves against the risk of the insurance they're selling. I don't understand that, and it's crazy. But because climate change is getting too expensive, and they're trading this risk back and forth, they've created what's called catastrophe bonds. These are debt instruments which repackage uncertainties to provide layers of financial protection. It reminds many of the mortgage-backed securities of 2008 crash and the government bailout. Insurance companies are protecting themselves in the short term and not worrying about what this means, implications for the future. Insurance is seeing some of its highest losses on record right now because of climate change. The storms, the flooding, the inundations. Climate change is a risk, but it's a gold rush opportunity for climate risk modelers and risk management firms. They even sell their predictions and make money on that. They hoard data to obfuscate the risk. The argument is that this data should be held in the common for public good. Commercial insurers make the world more perilous and then get rich selling insurance against the perils that they help to spawn. Risk is the inexhaustible engine of demand, and risks are unsatisfiable and infinite. Insurers in the US now offer concierge service to protect homes of the wealthy against fires. We need security for all people, not just the wealthy. Activists are trying to leverage the reduction of insurance industry support for fossil fuel. It's Machiavellian, what they're doing. They want to limit the upside of producers and get insurers to cut ties from fossil fuel production. 18 insurers said they would not work on the Canadian Trans Mountain Pipeline. A chance exists for all, but the probability can be calculated. In 1623, Pascal laid the groundwork for modern probability. In his posthumous publication, Pensée, he did what was called Pascal's wager. He bet on God and said religion is coin toss. Eventually, people began to see the risk of accidents and loss as consequences of unsafe situations, bad luck, not God's wrath. Social insurance, objected to by some as a lack of faith in God, would help a lot of people. The non-negligent victim of faulty harm was conceived. Okay, so what does that mean? Accident was invented. It was not preordained by God. Accidents, in other words, are predictable, and therefore affect how they can be insured. This led to the collective solution to personal adversity. This conflicted with the mindset of bosses in Kafka's bureaucracy, the blame the worker concept. In other words, taking on a more collective responsibility for everybody. We'll help people, we'll provide people if they have an unfortunate accident, it's not from their own poor relationship with God. Germany was one of the first to adopt a new approach to risk as public policy. In other words, companies taking responsibility, bosses taking responsibility. In 1883, Bismarck introduced social insurance for sickness in old age and workplace injury. He said that protecting citizens from insecurity is a right and not a charity. He included the radical idea of giving people money at retirement, but the very late and rare ages for the time of 70. Bismarck was an autocrat. He did his stuff to undercut socialists who were much more extreme. But this did change the course of history because it created social insurance as state subsidized collective entitlements. North America in the early 20th century, pushed by socialists and labor radicals, fought against the legal assumption of risk. Workers agree to whatever happens on a job. They're forced to take a death contract. Anything that happens on the job, we agree that it's just, an act of God or whatever. But not contributory negligence by the bosses, but by workers. Workers were always to blame. This was kind of the system starting, from the 20th century, early 20th century. But eventually Canada adopted a no-fault system and required the first mandatory workers' comp law based on 350-page study that was done of work accidents and deaths by Crystal Eastman, a feminist socialist iconoclast. Her law struck down Her law was struck down the day before the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire killed 146 young women, immigrant women mostly. And she said, what we want is to start a revolution. And in 1913, to amend the state constitution for workmen's comp in Canada. Witness to the fire, Frances Perkins, first female member of cabinet, Secretary of Labor under FDR, pushed him to go for protection for workers. Let's see here. I'm trying to find a good place to stop. I think I'll stop here. This is a weird chapter, and I'm going to end this here because if I try to complete the chapter, we'll be going on for an hour and a half, and I don't want to torture you like that. So this is the end of video number 4. I find it really difficult to read about the ways in which corporations and businesses and profiteers are willing to exploit people with just impunity for their own profit and financial gain. I know I sound naive. I just find it so difficult to understand. I acknowledge it happens. I'm aware it happens, but it's just reprehensible. And just this whole conversation about insurance companies, the back and forth. Why should we insure you? It's your fault that you get hurt when you're a worker. And in the meantime, we're playing behind the scenes to profit more and more conspiring with other insurance companies. We'll buy insurance from you, you buy insurance from us, we'll pass on the risk here and there, so that no matter who gets sued, everybody only suffers a little tiny bit in the way of the companies. It's reprehensible. It's awful. But the good news is there are solutions, so don't despair. And we'll be back with the rest soon. And in the meantime, slán go fóill, slánte.